A merchant stands accused of treason based on a forgotten clause in a royal charter. His entire future rests not on evidence, but on the interpretation of a single line of text written a century before he was born. This was the power of medieval law. We are going to explore 35 of the most important legal codes that defined an entire era, from the grand halls of Constantinople to the muddy fields of England. You will discover the hidden rules that dictated everything from the price of a stolen pig to the limits of a king's power. How did a legal text lost for centuries spark a revolution in justice? What strange customs allowed a poet to serve as a judge? By the end, you will see the medieval world not just as a time of knights and castles, but as a complex society built on a foundation of written rules. What do you believe is the most surprising thing a law can control? An emperor's ambition can reshape the world, but only the written word can make that change last 1,000 years. In the 6th century, the Byzantine Emperor Justinian faced a crisis of chaos. The vast body of Roman law had become a tangled, contradictory mess, scattered across countless scrolls and rulings. His solution was one of the most ambitious legal projects in history, the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law. This was not a single book, but a grand library of legal order compiled between the years 529 and 534. It was organized into 4 distinct parts, each with a crucial role. The Codex gathered all the existing imperial decrees and statutes into one coherent volume. The Digest was a massive achievement, a condensed summary of centuries of legal opinions from Rome's greatest jurists. Then came the Statutes, a textbook designed to train the next generation of lawyers in this new, unified system. Finally, the novels were used to record new laws passed by Justinian himself after the code was finished. The goal was absolute clarity, to sweep away the confusion and restore the legal glory of the Roman Empire. But its influence did not end at the borders of Byzantium. This monumental work became the bedrock of civil law across Europe, preserved and studied for centuries. Long after Rome's political power faded, its legal genius, as captured by Justinian, continued to guide kings, scholars, and courts. It proved that a society could be rebuilt from its laws. So, how did this Roman legal framework eventually find its way into a dispute between 2 farmers in medieval France? The answer lies in the next great legal tradition, one born not in an emperor's court, but in the scholarly quiet of a monastery. Yet the grand library of Justinian's code did not simply travel smoothly through time. For centuries, it vanished from Western Europe. The great books were lost, their wisdom silenced by the collapse of the empire that created them. Then, in the 11th century, a single surviving manuscript of the Digest was discovered in an Italian library. It was like finding a key to a forgotten lock. This single book ignited a legal firestorm. Scholars flocked to the city of Bologna, the first true university, to study this recovered treasure. They pored over its pages, debating its meanings and applying its ancient logic to a new world. This was not merely an academic exercise. The rediscovered Roman law provided a powerful, sophisticated system that kings and popes eagerly adopted. It began to shape the laws of the Church, known as canon law, and offered rulers a template for centralized, rational governance that was far superior to the patchwork of local customs. The code's return fundamentally altered the course of European justice. But what happens when a society chooses to build its laws not on a recovered empire, but on divine revelation? That path leads us to a different kind of legal revolution, one written in the language of faith and followed by millions. While scholars in Bologna were reviving the logic of Rome, a very different legal tradition had already taken root in the forests of northern Europe. The Salic law, or Lex Salica, was the law of the Franks, a Germanic people whose kingdom would one day become France. issued around the year 500, traditionally under King Clovis I. This code offers a raw, unvarnished look into a society where order was maintained not by imperial decree, but by a precise price list for human injury. This was the law of the wergild, the man price. Every person, from a noble to a freeman to an enslaved individual, had a specific value. If you killed someone, you did not necessarily face execution. Instead, you paid their wergild to their family. The price was staggeringly detailed. For the murder of a free Frank, the compensation was 200 solidi, a hefty sum of gold coins. But the law went much deeper, cataloging the cost of every possible harm. If you cut off someone's thumb, you owed 50 solidi. A severed index finger cost 35 because it was used for drawing a bow. If you called someone a liar or a fox, you paid a fine. This system was not about morality in the abstract. It was a practical mechanism to prevent endless blood feuds, to turn vengeance into a transaction that kept the peace. The code also meticulously governed property, especially farmland and livestock, the true measures of wealth. But one clause, buried among the prices for stolen pigs and damaged fences, would echo through history for 1,000 years. It stated that Salic land, the ancestral family property, could not be inherited by a woman. At the time, this was a local rule about private farmland. Yet centuries later, French lawyers would dust off this ancient text and reinterpret it to mean that no woman could inherit the crown of France. This single, repurposed line would shape the destiny of nations, excluding queens and justifying wars. It shows how a law written for one era can be resurrected to serve the politics of another. So, how did a legal system move from setting the price of a finger to governing the soul itself? That transformation required a code not of kings, but of popes. While the Salic law set prices for fingers in the forests of Gaul, a similar story of written order was unfolding to the south, in the sun-drenched landscape of Italy. Over a century after Justinian's great compilation, another Germanic people, the Lombards, were forging their own kingdom. Their ruler, King Rithari, faced a challenge familiar to any leader of a warrior society: how to tame the chaos of personal vengeance and build a stable state. His answer, issued in the year 643, was the Edict of Rithari, the first written legal code for the Lombard people. This was not a copy of Roman law, but a proud declaration of Lombard custom, a record of their own ancient ways now committed to parchment for all to see. It was a powerful act of state building, a king saying that justice would no longer be a matter of memory and oral tradition, but a public, written standard. The edict is a sprawling catalog of fines and compensations, a window into the daily dangers and social values of its time. The price for breaking a man's arm was carefully distinguished from the price for breaking his leg. A blow that merely drew blood cost one thing, while a blow that broke the skull cost vastly more. The law meticulously valued every part of the human body, from the loss of a big toe at 16 solidi to the cutting off of a nose, which demanded half the wergild, the full man price. But this was more than just a price list for violence. It was a legal shield for the people. One of its most famous clauses explicitly abolished the ancient, terrifying practice of feuds, the blood feud. No longer could a family take the law into their own hands to avenge a killing. From now on, the king's law and the king's courts would decide the appropriate compensation. This was a monumental shift, moving justice from a private, endless cycle of retaliation to a public, regulated process. Rithari was transforming his warriors into citizens, replacing the rule of the strong with the rule of the written word. His edict laid the foundation for the Lombard kingdom for generations, proving that a legal identity could be built not just on the legacy of Rome, but on the strength of one's own traditions. Across the sea, in the misty kingdom of Kent, a king faced a problem of persuasion. Ethelbert, the first Christian king of the Anglo-Saxons, needed a code of law that his people would actually follow. His solution, written around the year 602, was a landmark. The laws of Ethelbert are the earliest surviving legal code composed in a Germanic language. This was not a top-down imposition of a new faith, but a brilliant act of cultural translation. The code's foundation is thoroughly pagan and Germanic, a detailed tariff of compensations that would have been instantly familiar to any warrior in his hall. The law meticulously lists the wergild, the man price, for every rank of person, from the king down to the enslaved, but it then descends into astonishing specificity, assigning a price to almost every part of the human body. The fine for knocking out a front tooth was 6 shillings, while a molar was only 4. Breaking a rib cost 3 shillings, and the compensation for a pierced thumbnail was exactly 1. These were not arbitrary numbers, they were a precise calculus of a person's worth, their social standing, and their physical capacity to fight and work. The code was designed to prevent the very feuds that Rithari had outlawed in Italy, offering a clear, public price for peace. Yet woven into this familiar framework are the subtle, unmistakable threads of a new order. The very first clause grants the Church a special, protected status. It states that property of God and the Church should be compensated 12-fold, a massive multiplier compared to the standard fines. This single sentence reveals Ethelbert's genius. He was using the old language of compensation to build a privileged place for the new religion within his kingdom. He did not erase the old ways, he simply added the Church to the top of the existing social hierarchy, protecting it with the same legal logic his people had always understood. The code is a snapshot of a society in profound transition, where the price of a thumbnail existed alongside the first legal recognition of a Christian church in England. It proves that law can be a bridge, allowing a society to step into a new era without completely burning the old one down. What happens, though, when the law's purpose shifts from keeping peace between warriors to saving the very soul of a kingdom? That quest leads us to a code written not on parchment, but in the language of divine punishment. The price of a thumbnail in Kent was a matter of local custom, but in the Visigothic kingdom of Hispania, the legal ambition was far grander. King Rexuswinthe, in the year 654, presented his people with the Liber Judiciarum, the Book of Judgments. This was not a simple list of fines. It was a comprehensive, sophisticated legal system, one of the most advanced of the early Middle Ages, and its primary goal was unity. For centuries, the Visigoths and the native Hispano-Roman population had lived under separate laws, a division that created tension and instability. Rexuswinthe's code abolished that old system, declaring that one law would apply to everyone in the kingdom, regardless of their ethnic origin. This was a revolutionary step toward building a single, cohesive nation from 2 distinct peoples. The code's structure was remarkably thorough, organized into 12 books that methodically covered the entire landscape of human conflict and commerce. It detailed the laws of property, explaining exactly how land could be bought, sold, and inherited. It laid out complex procedures for criminal trials, moving justice away from brute force and toward formal evidence and testimony. It even regulated family life, dictating the rules for marriage, divorce, and the guardianship of children. One of its most striking features was its attempt to balance the old warrior customs of the Goths with the refined legal traditions of Rome. For instance, it limited the ancient right of a family to seek blood vengeance, channeling disputes into the royal courts instead. Yet, it also preserved elements of the wergild, setting specific compensations for injuries, though within a more orderly, state-controlled framework. The code's influence did not vanish with the Visigothic kingdom. For centuries after the Muslim conquest of Hispania, Christian communities living under Moorish rule continued to use the Liber Judiciarum to govern their own affairs. Later, as Christian kingdoms slowly reclaimed the peninsula, they looked back to this venerable code, mining it for legal principles that would shape the laws of Spain for generations. It stands as a powerful testament to the idea that law can be a tool not just for punishment, but for forging a common identity. But what happens when a legal system seeks to govern not only actions, but thoughts, creating a code for the soul itself? The Liber Judiciarum sought to unite a kingdom, but Charlemagne's ambition was to forge an empire. In the year 779, at his royal estate in Herstal, he issued a capitulary, a series of royal decrees that would reach into every corner of his realm. This was not a static code of old customs, but a dynamic blueprint for governing a vast and diverse territory. The Capitulary of Herstal reveals a ruler obsessed with moral and administrative order, seeing the strength of his state and the purity of its church as two sides of the same coin. He began with the clergy, commanding bishops and priests to live by the strict rules of their own monasteries, to cease their constant traveling, and to root out simony, the buying and selling of church offices. For Charlemagne, a corrupt or undisciplined clergy was a direct threat to the empire's stability, for how could God bless a kingdom whose spiritual leaders were flawed? His reforms then extended to the powerful counts who administered local justice. He demanded they hold regular courts and perform their duties justly without showing favoritism. But knowing the temptation for these regional lords to become little kings themselves, he created his most famous instrument of control, the missi dominicii, the envoys of the Lord. These were pairs of trusted men, usually a bishop and a count working together, who traveled assigned circuits throughout the empire. They were his eyes and ears, empowered to review the actions of local officials, hear complaints from the people, and ensure that the king's law, not a count's whim, was the final authority. It was a system of accountability on an imperial scale. The Capitulary also tackled public order with surprising detail, regulating everything from the pursuit of fleeing criminals to the proper observance of holidays. This document was the engine of the Carolingian Renaissance, proving that law could be used not just to punish, but to actively build a civilized Christian society. How does a legal system, however powerful, survive when the empire that created it begins to crumble? The answer lies in a desperate partition, a division of a realm that would shape the map of Europe for 1,000 years. Charlemagne's carefully constructed system of missi and capitularies could not outlast the empire itself. Just a generation after his death, his grandsons turned their ambitions against one another, tearing their inheritance apart not on the battlefield, but across a negotiating table. The year was 843, and the Treaty of Verdun was not a law code in the traditional sense. It was a peace treaty, a political document designed to end a brutal civil war. Yet its legal consequences would prove more enduring than any single edict. The three brothers, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, agreed to a tripartite division of the colossal Carolingian Empire. Lothair took the central strip, a long, unwieldy corridor of land from the North Sea down to Italy. Louis received the eastern territories, the lands largely east of the Rhine. Charles secured the western portion, a realm approximating much of modern France. With a few strokes of a pen, the ideal of a unified Christian empire was shattered, replaced by three rival kingdoms. The legal implications were immediate and profound. Before Verdun, there was at least a theoretical framework for a common law across the empire, propagated through royal capitularies. After Verdun, that framework collapsed. Each king now ruled his own domain, and his legal authority stopped at his new borders. They began to issue their own capitularies, but these only applied within their own fragmented kingdoms. The powerful counts and local lords within each territory, no longer supervised by imperial missi traveling from a central court, grew increasingly independent. In this political vacuum, local customs, the unwritten laws of specific regions and villages, began to harden into formal legal traditions. The old tribal laws, like the Salic law in the west and the various Saxon and Bavarian codes in the east, which had been somewhat subsumed under the Carolingian system, now found new life. They began to evolve in isolation, diverging from one another with each passing decade. The kingdom of Charles the Bald saw its legal traditions gradually coalesce into what would become the customary law of France, deeply influenced by its Roman and Frankish past. The kingdom of Louis the German became the incubator for the distinct legal customs of the German principalities. The treaty did not just divide land, it fractured a legal universe, planting the seeds for the centuries of legal divergence between the French and German traditions. Verdun proves that sometimes the most important legal document is not one that creates law, but one that creates the borders within which law can independently grow. If a treaty could forge two legal worlds from one empire, what kind of law could emerge from a single city built on a lagoon with its gaze fixed entirely on the sea? A king hides in the swamps, his kingdom overrun by Vikings, and he begins to plan not just a military comeback, but a legal one. Alfred the Great understood that to rebuild a shattered England, he needed a foundation stronger than stone walls. He needed a code of law that would restore the soul of his people. Around the year 893, he produced his Doom Book, a legal document unlike any that had come before it in England. It opens not with the decrees of a king, but with a direct translation of the 10 Commandments from the Bible, followed by large sections of the ancient Mosaic law from the book of Exodus. This was a radical starting point. Alfred was grounding his entire legal system not in the customs of his ancestors, but in the revealed law of God. He was making a profound statement that true justice for his kingdom flowed from a divine source. But Alfred was no mere copyist. He did not stop with scripture. He fused these Mosaic principles with the deep-rooted traditions of West Saxon custom and the enlightened Christian morality he had encountered on his travels. His code became a unique tapestry, weaving together the law of God, the wisdom of the church, and the practical needs of his people. For instance, the biblical injunction against false witness was paired with detailed procedures for oaths and testimony in his own courts. The ancient rule of an eye for an eye was tempered by the Christian value of mercy and a sophisticated system of fines and compensations designed to prevent endless bloodshed. One of his most famous laws stated that a man could fight for his lord without incurring a vendetta, and that no man should ever be executed for his first theft, but should instead pay a heavy fine. This was a deliberate move away from pure brutality and toward a more measured, restorative form of justice. Alfred's vision, however, extended far beyond the courtroom. He believed that for his laws to be truly effective, his people, especially those in power, needed to be literate. He lamented that there were very few men on this side of the Humber who could understand their divine service in English, let alone translate a single letter from Latin. So he launched a grand program of education, inviting scholars from across Europe and personally overseeing the translation of important Latin works into Old English. The Doom Book itself was written in English, not Latin, so that his judges and aldermen could actually read and understand the laws they were sworn to uphold. This was a legal revolution driven by a commitment to learning. The code was, in essence, a moral and intellectual shield for a society under constant threat, an attempt to create a holy and just nation that was worthy of survival. How does a society governed by such a pious code react when a new, powerful, and utterly different legal tradition arrives on its shores, not with a book, but with a sword? While Alfred's code drew its authority from the Bible, in the rugged hills of Wales, a king sought wisdom not only from Scripture but from the ancient customs of his people. In the middle of the 10th century, King Hywel Dda, Hywel the Good, convened a great assembly of wise men at a place called Tai Gwyn Ardaf. Their task was to gather, debate, and codify the traditional laws of Wales, creating a unified system that would be celebrated for its unique and surprisingly humane character. The laws of Hywel Dda present a legal world that feels distinct from both the Roman traditions of the continent and the penitential codes of England. Here, the status of women was notably advanced for its time. A Welsh woman could own property in her own name, and she retained control over the land she brought into a marriage. If the union ended, that land returned to her, a stark contrast to the Salic law that would later bar women from inheritance in France. A woman's testimony was also valued, especially in matters concerning other women. This legal recognition provided a layer of economic security and personal autonomy that was rare in medieval Europe. The system of compensation was as intricate as it was poetic. Every person, from the king down to the bondsman, had a fixed value known as the sarhid, the payment for insult or injury. The price was not just for death, but for every imaginable affront. The loss of a limb, a broken bone, even a specific scar on the face, each had its own precise valuation, but the law went deeper, considering the emotional and social cost of an injury. Striking a man in front of his lord or his wife carried a heavier fine because the public dishonor was considered part of the crime. This was a law deeply concerned with the restoration of social harmony, not merely the infliction of punishment. Perhaps the most unique feature of Hywel's court was the official role of the poet, the pensard. He was not merely an entertainer, he was a crucial legal officer. His duty was to memorize and recite the law in its entirety, preserving the complex web of rules and precedents through the power of his trained memory and his intricate verse. In a society where written records were still rare, the poet was the living library of the law, his voice the final authority on centuries of tradition. He would sit beside the judge, ready to supply the exact precedent or the proper formula for an oath. This fusion of law and art ensured the survival of a distinct Celtic legal identity for centuries, long after political independence was lost. The laws of Hywel Dda show us a path not taken by much of Europe, a system where compensation balanced vengeance, where women held tangible rights, and where the custodian of justice was also a master of verse. How does a legal system evolve when it is forced to reconcile two peoples, two faiths on a single island? That challenge would define the next great code, born from the clash of Norman steel and Anglo-Saxon tradition. The poet's verse could calm a Welsh court, but across the Channel, the clash of swords was becoming a constant din. By the 10th century, the collapse of central authority had left France a patchwork of warring lords, their private armies turning the countryside into a stage for endless, petty warfare. It was the church that finally intervened, not with an army, but with a radical spiritual decree. This was the peace of God, a series of church councils beginning in the late 10th century that declared certain people and places utterly off-limits to violence. Under threat of excommunication, knights were forbidden from attacking clergy, pilgrims, or the poor. Churches and their immediate surroundings became sanctuaries, islands of enforced calm in a sea of conflict. This was soon followed by the Truce of God, which turned its focus to time itself. It demanded that all fighting cease from Wednesday evening until Monday morning every week, and throughout the entire seasons of Advent and Lent. For nearly half the year, the swords were supposed to remain still. Imagine the profound impact on a peasant family, knowing that for these sacred days, their fields and their lives were, in theory, safe from the rampaging of a local lordsman. The enforcement was as dramatic as the rules themselves. Priests would carry relics of saints into the fields, gathering massive crowds of common people who would swear oaths to uphold the peace, creating a powerful wave of popular pressure that even the most belligerent knight could not easily ignore. This was not a law code issued by a king, for there was no king powerful enough to command it. It was a bottom-up movement using the only universal authority left, the moral power of the church, to carve out spaces of safety for the most vulnerable. It represented a fundamental shift, asserting that there was a higher good than a lord's right to make war, and that society itself had a right to peace. How does a society move from declaring a truce with God to building a permanent legal framework for that peace? That step required a king with the will to enforce it, and a document that would apply to everyone, not just the pious. The peace of God offered sanctuary, but it was a king's command that would forge a system of justice. In 1166, King Henry II of England issued a decree from his palace at Clarendon that would fundamentally reshape how crimes were discovered and punished. The Assize of Clarendon was a direct assertion of royal power over a kingdom still simmering with the disorder of the previous century. Its central innovation was a new legal body, the presenting jury. This was not a trial jury as we know it today. Instead, it was a panel of 12 lawful men from every 100, a local district, and 4 men from every ville or village. Their duty was to gather under oath and name every person in their community suspected of robbery, theft, or murder. This was a revolutionary shift from a system where prosecution relied on a private accuser. Now the community itself, through its sworn representatives, became the voice of the king's justice. The accused, once named by this jury of presentment, faced a swift and terrifying process. They were immediately arrested and brought before the royal justices. There, they were subjected to the trial by ordeal, most commonly the ordeal of water or iron. This was a brutal, divine test where the guilt or innocence of the accused was believed to be revealed by God through their physical reaction to scalding water or a red-hot piece of metal. The Assize made this practice a standard, state-sanctioned procedure for those accused by the presenting jury, but the true, lasting genius of the Assize lay not in the ordeal, but in the jury. By creating a formal mechanism for public accusation, Henry II laid the essential foundation for the entire English common law system. This body of sworn locals reporting to a royal official created a consistent, nationwide standard for initiating criminal cases, slowly pulling the administration of justice away from local barons and into the king's own courts. The presenting jury of Clarendon is the direct ancestor of the modern grand jury, the body that still decides whether there is enough evidence for a formal indictment. It transformed justice from a private feud or a local custom into a public duty, a matter for the crown and the entire community. How does a legal system move from this public accusation to a public trial, where a different kind of jury would listen to evidence and decide a person's fate? Henry II's Assize of Clarendon had asserted royal power over crime, but a far more dangerous frontier of law remained, the special status of the clergy. Just 2 years later, in 1164, the king summoned his magnates and bishops to a royal hunting lodge at Clarendon. There, he presented 16 articles known as the Constitutions of Clarendon, a document that sought to draw a permanent, legal boundary between his royal courts and the courts of the church. The king's goal was clear and rational to his mind: to create a single, unified legal system for all his subjects. The most explosive point was Article 3. It declared that any cleric, anyone in holy orders who was accused of a serious crime, must first be summoned to the king's court. Only after the royal justices had heard the charge would the accused be sent to an ecclesiastical court for trial. And if he were found guilty there, the church was forbidden from shielding him. he would be stripped of his clerical status and handed back to the king's officers for earthly punishment. For Henry, this was simple logic and good governance. A murderer in a priest's robe was still a murderer, and he should not escape the full force of the law simply because he was tried in a church court, which could not impose blood punishments like execution or mutilation. But for the church, and for one man in particular, this was an unconscionable assault on the liberty of the church, a direct attack on its God-given right to judge its own. That man was Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and once the king's closest friend and chancellor. Becket had undergone a dramatic transformation since becoming archbishop, trading his lavish lifestyle for one of austere piety. He saw the constitutions not as administrative reform, but as sacrilege. He argued that it subjected God's anointed priests to the judgment of laymen, violating the principle of benefit of clergy, the ancient legal immunity that placed clerics beyond the reach of secular punishment. The conflict was no longer just about legal jurisdiction, it was about the very soul of England. Would the crown ultimately command the church, or would the church remain a separate, spiritual power? The confrontation escalated from a legal debate into a bitter personal feud. Becket initially seemed to yield under immense pressure, but then he recanted, fleeing into exile for 6 years. The 16 Articles of Clarendon had torn the kingdom in two. The situation reached its terrible climax in 1170 when Becket returned to Canterbury. In the dim light of his own cathedral, 4 of the king's knights, believing they were carrying out Henry's furious wishes, struck down the archbishop, scattering his brains on the stone floor. The murder of a primate in his own church sent a shockwave of horror throughout Christendom. Becket was instantly venerated as a martyr, and Henry was forced to perform a very public penance, walking barefoot through the streets of Canterbury and submitting to a scourging by the monks. In the end, the legal victory Henry sought at Clarendon was largely lost in the wake of the assassination. The church's right to try its own clerics was, for the most part, preserved for centuries more. The constitutions of Clarendon stand as a stark monument to the limits of royal power, a reminder that even the most logical legal reform can shatter against the rock of deeply held belief. How does a society begin to write down the law of the land when that land has just been conquered by a foreign power, and the law must serve two peoples, the conquerors and the conquered? The king's justice ended at the city gates, while Thomas Becket's blood still stained the stones of Canterbury. A different kind of rebellion was brewing in the fertile plains of Lombardy. Here, the threat was not a king's overreach, but an emperor's ambition. Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, saw the rich, independent cities of northern Italy not as partners, but as disobedient subjects. He demanded absolute sovereignty, the right to appoint their officials and collect their taxes, treating their cherished communal freedoms as a privilege he could revoke. The cities saw it differently. Milan, Brescia, Piacenza, and others had grown wealthy and self-reliant, governing themselves through their own elected councils and written statutes. They were not willing to surrender their hard-won autonomy to an absent German emperor. Their resistance needed a legal form, a binding structure stronger than any temporary army. That structure was born in 1167 in the small town of Pontida, where representatives from these cities gathered and swore a solemn oath. This was not a loose alliance, it was a constitutional act, the creation of the Lombard League. The oath itself was their foundational legal code, a mutual defense pact that bound each city to the others with the force of law. They pledged to defend one another against imperial aggression, to contribute soldiers and funds to a common army, and to make no separate peace with Barbarossa. This oath created a new legal entity, a sovereign league of cities that could collectively negotiate treaties, wage war, and administer the territories they controlled. Each city brought its own intricate web of communal statutes, its detailed laws on trade, property, and civic offices into this new federation. The League's legal framework was a patchwork of these urban constitutions, united by the supreme law of the Pontida Oath. It proved that law could be a weapon of defense, a shield forged by communities to protect their liberty from a crown. The League's greatest victory was not just military, but legal. After defeating Barbarossa at the Battle of Legnano, they forced the emperor to the negotiating table. The resulting Peace of Constance in 1183 was a legal triumph, a formal treaty where the emperor was compelled to recognize the right of the Lombard cities to govern themselves, to elect their own consuls, and to maintain their own laws. The League's legal code, born from an oath of defiance, had forced the most powerful man in Europe to acknowledge the sovereignty of urban communes. How does a legal system develop when the people writing the laws are not kings or emperors, but merchants and craftsmen building a republic on a lagoon? A kingdom of faith and steel was being forged on the edge of the world. In the dusty heat of the Levant, the Crusader knights who had captured Jerusalem found themselves ruling a land of ancient cities and diverse peoples. They were an alien ruling class, a tiny Christian elite governing a vast population of Muslims, Jews, and Eastern Christians. To bring order to this complex society, they did something remarkable: they wrote it all down. The result was the Assizes of Jerusalem, a sprawling legal code that became the supreme law of the kingdom. This was not a single document created at one moment, but a living body of law that evolved over the 12th and 13th centuries, a fascinating fusion of the customs the knights brought with them and the realities they encountered. The code was divided into two main parts, each governing a different segment of society. The Assizes of the High Court detailed the law for the nobility, the knights and barons. It was a deeply feudal document, outlining the precise obligations a vassal owed to his lord and the limits of the king's own power. The king himself was not an absolute monarch. He was bound by the law and had to rule with the consent of his high court, a council of his most powerful barons. This was French feudal custom, transplanted to the Holy Land, but then there were the Assizes of the bourgeois court, the law for the commoners, the merchants, the craftsmen, and the non-knightly settlers. This section was a stunningly pragmatic blend of legal traditions. It drew from Roman law, which had never entirely vanished from the Eastern Mediterranean, and it incorporated elements of local custom, dealing with the realities of trade, property disputes, and the daily interactions between Frankish settlers and their indigenous neighbors. The code had to answer questions no European law book had ever considered. What were the inheritance rights of a Syrian Christian woman married to a Frankish merchant? How was a contract for the sale of olive oil from a Muslim farmer to a Venetian trader to be enforced? The laws provided a framework for these cross-cultural transactions, creating a measure of predictable justice that allowed the diverse economy to function. The treatment of religious minorities was particularly complex. Muslim and Jewish subjects were not citizens in the modern sense, but they were granted a legally protected status. They were allowed to practice their own faith, to be judged in their own communal courts on matters of personal law like marriage and inheritance, and they had access to the bourgeois courts for commercial and criminal cases. This was not tolerance born of modern ideals, but a practical necessity for ruling a multi-faith society. The entire system was an elaborate legal experiment, an attempt to build a stable state using the best tools available, whether they came from a French castle, a Roman codex, or a Levantine marketplace. This fragile legal order, however, was entirely dependent on the kingdom's military strength. When that strength finally failed and Jerusalem fell, the law books were carried into exile, becoming sacred texts of a lost realm. How does a legal system survive when the land it was written for is gone forever? A king's seal pressed into wax could not erase the humiliation. In a meadow called Runnymede beside the River Thames in the year 1215, King John of England faced a circle of his most powerful barons, men whose loyalty he had exhausted through years of heavy taxes and arbitrary justice. The document they forced him to authorize, the Magna Carta, was born not from philosophical ideals, but from raw political necessity. It was a peace treaty between a failing king and his rebellious subjects, a detailed list of grievances meant to curb the crown's worst abuses. Yet within its 63 clauses, written in dense Latin, lay the seeds of a revolutionary principle that the power of a ruler was not absolute, but bound by the law of the land. The Charter's most famous clause, number 39, declared that no free man could be seized, imprisoned, or stripped of his rights except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. This was the bedrock of due process, a shield against the king's ability to simply arrest anyone he disliked. Another clause promised that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed, a direct response to John's habit of extorting money for legal favors or holding trials indefinitely. The Church's right to elect its own officials freely was guaranteed, a crucial concession after John had clashed with the Pope, and for the barons, it established precise limits on the feudal payments they owed, protecting them from the king's financial whims. The Charter even created a council of 25 barons empowered to oversee the king's compliance, with the right to seize his castles and lands if he broke its terms, a remarkable early mechanism for enforcing a contract against a monarch. Of course, the immediate impact was limited. Pope Innocent III swiftly annulled the Charter, declaring it shameful and illegal, and a civil war erupted almost immediately. King John died the next year, and the document was reissued several times in later reigns, often with clauses removed. It was, in its moment, a failure. But its words refused to die. The core idea that a ruler must govern according to established customs and legal procedures echoed through the centuries. Future generations would rediscover and reinterpret the Great Charter, invoking its principles to challenge the divine right of kings and to build the foundations of constitutional government. How does a legal tradition grow when it is not written in a single monumental document, but is instead built case by case, ruling by ruling, in the busy courtrooms of a king? A king's charter could be annulled, but the law of the land was written in the daily lives of its people. While the Magna Carta was being contested in England, a lone Saxon knight named Eik von Riepkau was quietly compiling a different kind of legal masterpiece in a small village in northern Germany. He called it the Sachsenspiegel, the mirror of the Saxons. This was not a king's decree, but a systematic recording of the ancient customs and laws that had governed Saxon society for generations, passed down orally and now, for the first time, set down in a clear, accessible German. Eich's genius lay in his organization and his purpose. He divided his mirror into two distinct parts. The first was Landrecht, the law of the land, which applied to everyone. It covered the legal relationships between free people, the rules for property, inheritance, and the complex procedures for settling disputes in local courts. The second part was Leinrecht, feudal law, which detailed the specific obligations and rights binding lords and their vassals, the hierarchy of service and loyalty that structured the nobility. This separation was a stroke of clarity, acknowledging that society operated on two parallel legal tracks. The Sachsenspiegel is a window into a world where law was deeply visual and communal. Its most famous copies are breathtaking illuminated manuscripts, where the text is accompanied by vibrant illustrations that make the law's principles instantly understandable, even to those who could not read. A dispute over a field boundary might be shown with two farmers standing beside a row of stones. The hierarchy of the feudal court is depicted as a ladder of authority, with the king at the top and each rank of vassal below. These images were not mere decoration, they were a fundamental part of the legal text, a mnemonic device, and a tool for teaching. The code's substance was just as revolutionary. It asserted that the king's power was not absolute, but derived from the people, and that a ruler who broke the law could be judged by his own subjects. It also contained a detailed peace code, or Friedensrecht, which carefully regulated the right to feud, turning the ancient practice of vengeance into a legally sanctioned process with strict rules and time limits, rather than an outright ban. This pragmatic approach made the Sachsenspiegel immensely popular and practical. Its influence did not stop at the borders of Saxony. It was copied and adapted across the German-speaking world and far into Central and Eastern Europe, becoming the foundation for legal systems in Poland, Bohemia, and beyond. It proved that the authority of a law book could come not from a royal seal, but from its sheer usefulness and its profound connection to the customs of the people. If a knight could codify the law of the land, what kind of law would emerge from the bustling, self-governing streets of a city that had no king at all? A knight could record the law of his people, but an emperor could use law to sculpt a kingdom from the chaos of many cultures. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, inherited a realm at the crossroads of the world, a vibrant mix of Norman, Lombard, Greek, and Arab influences. In 1231, from the town of Melfi, he issued a legal masterpiece that would become the marvel of the 13th century, the Constitutions of Melfi, also known as the Liber Augustalis. This was no simple list of fines or feudal customs. It was a complete, rational, and centralized blueprint for a modern state, a system of governance so advanced it would not be rivaled in Europe for generations. Frederick, a man of immense intellect and ambition, saw law not as a record of the past, but as a tool to shape the future. He drew upon every source of wisdom available to him, weaving threads from the recovered Roman law of Justinian, the pragmatic administrative practices of his Norman predecessors, and even the efficient bureaucracy he admired from the Islamic world. The result was a code that asserted the crown's authority over every aspect of life. It began with a profound declaration that the emperor was the sole source of law, the living law on earth. This immediately centralized all legal power in his person, stripping it away from rebellious local barons and independent city communes. But this was not arbitrary tyranny. It was authority exercised through a meticulously organized system of royal officials and professional judges. These judges were no longer local lords dispensing rough justice. They were salaried, educated men appointed by the crown, required to base their verdicts on the written evidence and procedures laid out in the code itself. The constitutions of Melfi reached into spheres no medieval code had ever dared to regulate so thoroughly. It established and governed the University of Naples, Frederick's own foundation, dictating everything from the curriculum to the professors' salaries, ensuring the state would have a steady supply of trained administrators and lawyers. It set strict standards for medical practice, requiring physicians to be licensed and to swear an oath to treat the poor without charge. It even contained early consumer protection laws, standardizing weights and measures across the kingdom to prevent fraud in the bustling markets of Palermo and Messina. The code's criminal law was severe and aimed at creating public order, prescribing brutal punishments for rebellion and treason, yet it also displayed a surprising rationality, limiting the use of judicial duels and ordeals in favor of evidence and witness testimony. This was a legal engine designed for efficiency and control, a kingdom run like a vast, intricate machine with the emperor as its master engineer. How does a legal system born in the bright, bureaucratic sunlight of Sicily adapt to the misty, tradition-bound halls of England, where law was not decreed by a single will, but built over centuries by countless judges? Frederick II's rational state was a blueprint for one man's power, but in the sun-baked heart of Castile, a different king dreamed of a kingdom ruled not just by his will, but by the boundless power of human knowledge. Alfonso X, known as El Sabio, the Wise, saw law not as a tool of control, but as an act of enlightenment. His monumental creation, the Civilis Partitas, drafted around 1265, was far more than a legal code. It was a vast encyclopedia of wisdom, a 7-part summation of all human and divine law intended to guide his people toward a more just and civilized society. This was a work of breathtaking ambition, a library of legal and philosophical thought compiled by a team of the kingdom's greatest scholars, jurists, and clerics. The 7 parts methodically built a complete worldview. The first part laid the theological foundation, defining the doctrines of the Catholic faith and the structure of the Church. The second part detailed the authority of the king, the rights of the people, and the proper conduct of warfare, blending Roman political theory with Christian morality. From there, the Partitas descended into the intimate details of human life, covering justice and court procedure, family law including marriage and the guardianship of orphans, the complex world of contracts and commercial transactions, and finally, the laws of crime and punishment. Its influences were as vast as its scope, drawing deeply from the recovered Roman law of Justinian, the intricate canon law of the Church, and even the philosophical works of Aristotle and the wisdom of the ancients. Alfonso's goal was a uniform legal system, a single, rational body of law that would replace the tangled patchwork of local customs and feudal privileges, or fueros, that fragmented his kingdom. He envisioned judges reaching for this one book to find the answer to any question, from a dispute over a shipping contract to the proper punishment for a thief. Yet, in a great irony, this masterpiece was initially too advanced for its time. The powerful nobles of Castile, fiercely protective of their ancient fueros, resisted the imposition of this sweeping, learned code. For decades, the Civilis Partitas sat not as the active law of the land, but as a revered legal textbook, a source of principles for judges and scholars. Its time would come much later, when its profound wisdom was finally recognized as the supreme law of Castile. Its influence then spread across the ocean, shaping the legal foundations of Spain's American colonies and leaving a lasting mark on the laws of Texas, Louisiana, and California. The Partitas proved that a law book could be a vessel for an entire civilization's highest aspirations. But what happens when a legal system is not written in the quiet of a scholar's study, but shouted in the clamor of a public square, forged by the collective will of a people determined to govern themselves? The king's peace was a fragile thing, broken by civil war and slowly rebuilt with ink and parchment. In 1267, 2 years after the final defeat of the rebel barons at Evesham, King Henry III put his seal to the Statute of Marlborough. This was not a revolutionary document born of rebellion like the Magna Carta, but a practical, hard-won settlement designed to mend the tears in the fabric of English law. Its great legacy is its endurance, for parts of the Statute of Marlborough remain law in England and Wales today, making it the oldest statute still officially in force. The statute's 59 chapters were a direct response to the grievances that had fueled the Barons' War, a systematic effort to curb the abuses of royal officials and protect the property rights of all free subjects. It explicitly reinforced key principles from the Magna Carta, particularly the promise that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed, but it also went much further, tackling specific, everyday injustices. One of its most important provisions, found in Chapter 29, was a powerful shield for property owners. It stated that no man, not even the king, could seize a person's land or goods without a legal judgment. This was a direct blow against the arbitrary power of local sheriffs and bailiffs who might confiscate property on a whim or a false accusation. Another chapter tackled the problem of distraint, the practice of seizing a person's assets to force them to appear in court. The statute set strict limits on this power, forbidding officials from taking so much that it ruined a person, like seizing all their plow animals and leaving them unable to farm. It was a law that understood the line between enforcing the law and destroying a life. The Statute of Marlborough was a landmark in the history of Parliament, one of the first major statutes enacted with the clear advice and consent of the barons in a parliamentary assembly. It represented a crucial step toward the idea that the king's most important laws required the agreement of the community of the realm. This was the slow, steady work of building a state governed by laws, not just by the will of one man. How does a legal tradition, so focused on the rights of free men, begin to address the plight of the unfree, the vast majority who worked the land but owned nothing? The king's law was a distant rumor until the justices in Eyre rode into town. This was the Eyre system, the nervous system of English common law, and it transformed justice from a local custom into a national standard. Royal judges appointed by the crown would arrive in a county without warning, their authority absolute. Their purpose was twofold: to hold court and to conduct a sweeping inquest into the entire community. They would summon a jury of local knights and freeholders and demand answers under oath to a long list of articles, a public audit of the previous several years. Had any murders gone unpunished? Had the local sheriff taken bribes? Were the king's highways safe? Had anyone encroached on royal forests? This was more than a trial, it was a general review of every aspect of local government. The sheer volume of information gathered was staggering, and every word was meticulously recorded by scribes onto long parchment rolls sewn together at the top. These were the Eyre rolls, the vast, unbroken memory of the king's justice. They captured everything from the most serious felony to a dispute over a stray pig, creating an immense and growing body of precedent. This was the true engine of legal standardization. A judgment made by a judge in Yorkshire would be recorded, and years later, a judge in Cornwall could consult a roll and see how a similar case had been resolved. Slowly, erratically, the law began to cohere. The customs of 100 different manors were gradually absorbed into a single, common law for the entire realm, a law that was common to all. It was a system built on written evidence and public testimony, pulling power away from local barons and into the centralized machinery of the royal courts. The Eyre was often feared as an instrument of royal power and heavy fines, but its legacy was the creation of a predictable, documented legal process that anyone, in theory, could access. How does a legal system born from royal judges and parchment rolls transform when it is codified not by a king, but by a republic of merchants who see law not as a command, but as a contract? Royal power could command a single law for all, but the soul of France was woven from 100 local customs. From the 13th century onward, a quiet revolution began in the northern provinces, a movement to write down the law as it was actually lived. These were the cautoms, the official records of regional customary law. For generations, justice in places like Normandy, Brittany, and the Isle de France had been based on unwritten traditions, passed from father to son and remembered by village elders. A dispute over a boundary stone or the inheritance of a vineyard was settled not by a royal decree from Paris, but by the ancient custom of that specific place. This created a legal landscape of astonishing diversity, where the rules changed utterly from one day's walk to the next. The process of reduction, of writing these customs down, was a monumental act of legal preservation. Royal commissioners would travel to a region, summon the local lords, clergy, and leading citizens, and painstakingly questioned them. What was the law here for paying a feudal relief? How many witnesses were required to prove a debt? What portion of an estate did a widow rightly inherit? The answers, debated and agreed upon, were then written into a formal, binding text, the cautum of that region. The most influential of all was the Cautum de Paris. This was not a radical new invention, but a brilliant synthesis. It blended the deep Frankish roots of the Salic law with the logical structure of recovered Roman law and the practical realities of feudal relationships. It became the common law of the northern French royal domain, a model of clarity and cohesion. The Cautum de Paris meticulously governed everything from marital property to commercial contracts. It famously established the community of property between husband and wife, a revolutionary concept that gave a wife a legal claim to half the assets acquired during the marriage. It also provided detailed rules for the sale of land and the inheritance of noble titles, creating a predictable framework for society to function. This written custom did not erase local variation, but it provided a powerful, respected standard. Centuries later, when Napoleon's jurists set out to create a single, unified civil code for all of France, they did not start from scratch. They turned to the clear, pragmatic, and deeply French traditions codified in the Cautum de Paris, weaving its principles into the very fabric of modern European law. How does a legal system evolve when it is not written by kings or commissioners, but by the merchants and craftsmen of a powerful, independent city republic? A king's gold seal could not buy back his honor. In 1222, King Andrew II of Hungary stood before his rebellious nobles, his treasury drained by failed military campaigns and his authority crumbling. To save his crown, he was forced to grant the Golden Bull, a charter of liberties that would bind the monarchy for centuries. Like its English counterpart, this was a peace treaty extracted from a weakened ruler, but its terms were uniquely Hungarian, forged in the plains of Eastern Europe. The bull began with a sweeping promise that the king and his successors would not seize the property of nobles or the high clergy, nor would they tax their estates without the consent of the royal council. This was a direct assault on the king's ability to fund his government arbitrarily, placing a powerful check on his financial power, but the bull's most radical clause was its confirmation of the ius resistendi, the right of resistance. It declared that if the king or his successors ever violated these liberties, the nobles and prelates of the realm had the legal right to oppose him without being branded traitors. This was not a vague suggestion, it was a constitutional safety valve written into the foundational law of the kingdom. The charter also addressed the growing problem of foreign influence and the distribution of royal favor. It stipulated that only native Hungarians could hold the highest offices of state and receive the most valuable lands, a move to prevent the king from packing his court with foreigners who owed him everything. Furthermore, it guaranteed that the annual National Assembly, the Diet, would be held at a fixed location, ensuring the nobility a regular platform to voice their grievances and influence royal policy. The Golden Bull did not create a democracy, it entrenched the power of a feudal aristocracy, yet by legally limiting the crown and giving the political community a formal voice, it established a contractual model of kingship in Hungary. For centuries, this document served as the bedrock of the Hungarian constitution, a constant reminder that even a king was subject to the law of the land. How does a legal system born from a king's concession to his nobles compare to one crafted by the collective will of an entire city, where merchants and artisans held the power to write their own laws? Yet a king's golden charter could not erase the stubborn reality of local life. While Alfonso the Wise dreamed of a single, rational law for all of Castile, the true legal landscape of his kingdom was a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of countless local rules. This was the world of the feuds, the charters of privileges granted by kings to towns and regions, and around 1240, someone began to compile them into the Libro de los Feuds de Castilla. This book was not a top-down code, but a collection from the ground up, a testament to the fierce independence of each community. A feudo was a deal struck between a distant crown and a fledgling town, often on the dangerous frontier with Muslim Spain. In exchange for loyalty and for settlers to brave the borderlands, the king granted the town a remarkable degree of self-government. Its own elected council could judge local disputes, regulate its markets, and collect its own taxes. This created a legal patchwork where the law changed dramatically from one city wall to the next. In one town, the fine for stealing a chicken might be 10 maravedis, while just a day's ride away, the same crime could cost 20. The rules for inheriting a vineyard or proving a debt were entirely local matters. This system fostered a powerful sense of municipal identity. A man from Burgos was not just a subject of the king, he was a Burgalese, bound by and proud of the unique rights and customs of his city. His feudo was his shield against the arbitrary power of a local lord and his guarantee of a familiar, predictable justice. The Libro de los Feuds de Castilla captures this intricate mosaic, revealing a kingdom where royal authority had to negotiate with 100 self-governing republics. How does a society balance this deep-rooted local autonomy with the relentless march toward a unified, national law? The king's will was no longer the law of the land. In the year 1258, a council of 15 barons faced Henry III of England and presented him with the provisions of Oxford, a constitutional document so radical it stripped the monarchy of its ancient powers. This was not a request, it was a political ultimatum born from years of royal mismanagement and foreign favoritism. The provisions created a new form of government, a council of 15 barons who would effectively rule alongside the king. Every major decision, from the appointment of ministers to the control of royal castles, now required their consent. The king could no longer dismiss his chief justiciar, the head of the legal system, at a whim. This baronial council was to meet 3 times a year or more often if needed, to oversee the entire administration of the realm. It was a direct takeover of the state, a legal coup designed to place the crown in a permanent partnership with its most powerful subjects. The provisions also mandated regular parliaments, requiring representatives from each county to gather and discuss the affairs of the kingdom. This was a crucial step toward a more representative government, embedding the idea that the community of the realm had a permanent voice in its own governance. The reforms reached deep into the machinery of justice, demanding an overhaul of the sheriffs, the local officials whose corruption was a constant source of grievance. For a few brief years, England was governed not by a king alone, but by a committee bound by a written constitution. The provisions of Oxford marked the peak of baronial ambition, a daring experiment to replace personal rule with the rule of a council. But could a king who had surrendered his power ever truly accept such a change? The royal counterattack was not a matter of if, but when. The Royal Council at Oxford was a brief experiment in shared power, but in the golden halls of Constantinople, imperial authority remained absolute. Nearly 4 centuries after Justinian's great legal project, another emperor sought to reclaim its legacy. Leo VI, known as the Wise, faced a problem of language and time. The majestic Latin of the Corpus Juris Civilis was no longer widely understood in his Greek-speaking empire, and centuries of new laws and interpretations had created a new tangle of confusion. His solution was the Basilica, the Royal Laws, a monumental work completed around the year 900. This was not a new legal philosophy, but a masterful act of translation and reorganization. The Basilica took the entire body of Justinian's law, the Codex, the Digest, the Institutes, and the novels, and rendered it all into clear, accessible Greek. It condensed the sprawling library into 60 books, systematically arranging the material by subject to make it infinitely more practical for judges and lawyers to use. Imagine a judge in a provincial court, no longer struggling with archaic Latin terms, but able to consult a single, coherent volume in his own language to resolve a dispute over a shipping contract or a property boundary. The Basilica became the bedrock of Byzantine justice for the empire's final 6 centuries, a living link to its Roman past that ensured legal continuity even as its political and military fortunes declined. It proved that the power of a legal code lies not just in its creation, but in its constant renewal, its ability to speak to each new generation in a language they can understand. How does a legal tradition sustain itself when the empire that created it is breathing its last, and new powers are rising in the West with entirely different ideas of justice? A castle on a contested border was its own sovereign state. The Norman lords who carved out their domains in the Welsh marches were granted a power almost equal to a king's, the right to create their own law. These marcher lordships were legal anomalies, pockets of absolute authority where the common law of England simply stopped at the gate. The king's writ did not run here. Instead, each lord could establish his own courts, declare his own crimes, and set his own punishments, forging a legal regime designed for one purpose: control over a hostile and newly conquered land. The law in a lordship like Glamorgan or Pembroke was often a brutal fusion of Norman military necessity and adapted Welsh custom. The lords imposed harsh forest laws, declaring vast tracts of land off limits for hunting or foraging, with poaching punishable by mutilation or death. They established their own complex systems of fines and taxes, extracting wealth from the native population with an efficiency that the distant English crown could only envy. Yet, for the system to function, it also had to offer a measure of predictable justice. Disputes between Welsh villagers were often settled by incorporating elements of the very laws of Hywel Dda they had lived under for generations, but now filtered through the Lord's court and interpreted by his appointed bailiffs. This created a strange legal hybrid, where a Norman knight might preside over a case involving traditional Welsh compensation for an injury, but the final judgment and the heavier fine would always flow to the Lord's treasury. The marcher lords became little lawgivers, their authority a testament to the crown's desperate need to tame a wild frontier by delegating the power of life and death. This patchwork of private legalities survived for centuries, a stubborn remnant of feudal power that would only be dismantled when a Tudor king, himself of Welsh blood, finally decided to unite the two nations under a single, imperial crown. How does a legal system born from the chaos of a military frontier compare to one meticulously crafted for the orderly governance of a peaceful, prosperous city? North of England's shifting borders, a kingdom was forging its own legal identity from an unexpected source. The Regium Majestatem, Scotland's great legal treatise from the 14th century, stands as a testament to a nation's ability to borrow, adapt, and claim a foreign text as its own. Its very foundation is a puzzle, for it leans heavily on an English source, the late 12th century legal work known as Glanville, yet this was no simple copy. Scottish jurists took the framework of their powerful neighbor and meticulously reshaped it to fit the distinct contours of their own society, its feudal relationships, and its unique royal courts. The treatise's Latin title, meaning concerning the majesty of the crown, reveals its primary focus, the pleas of the crown. These were the most serious crimes, offenses like murder, robbery, and arson that were considered direct violations of the king's peace and were tried before his justices. The Regium Majestatem provided the procedural roadmap for these high-stakes cases, defining how suspects were to be accused, arrested, and brought to judgment. But its scope extended far beyond crime. It delved deeply into the complex world of feudal landholding, detailing the services a Scottish knight owed his lord, the rules for inheriting estates, and the legal remedies for a disputed title to a patch of Highland soil. This blending of English form with Scottish substance created a durable foundation. For centuries, the Regium Majestatum was copied, studied, and cited in Scottish courtrooms, becoming a core pillar of the emerging common law of Scotland. It proved that legal sovereignty is not always about invention, but often about the intelligent and deliberate adaptation of the best tools available, transforming them until they become unmistakably your own. How does a legal system born from scholarly adaptation compare to one forged in the fires of a peasant revolt, where the law is written not for kings and lords, but for the common man who works the land? A king's law could not cross the sea, but a merchant's contract could bind a continent. While monarchs struggled to enforce their writ beyond their own borders, the merchants of the Hanseatic League were weaving a legal web that stretched from London to Novgorod. This was not a code imposed by a crown, but a pragmatic system of commercial law born from the shared need for profit and protection. The League's legal framework was a collection of ordinances and agreements meticulously crafted to solve the practical problems of long-distance trade. At its heart were the statutes governing the contours, the fortified trading posts established in foreign cities like Bruges, Bergen, and London. These were self-contained legal worlds where Hanseatic merchants lived under their own laws, judged by their own elected officials. A dispute between a Lübeck merchant and a Cologne merchant over a shipment of timber in the London steel yard would be settled not by the English King's Court, but by a Hanseatic alderman according to their shared commercial code. This system provided a predictable, familiar justice that was essential for business. The laws standardized everything. They defined the quality of goods, ensuring that a barrel of salted herring from Scania met the same standard whether it was sold in Flanders or Prussia. They established complex rules for maritime insurance and salvage, determining who bore the loss when a ship foundered in a Baltic storm. They even set the interest rates that could be charged on loans, preventing usury from poisoning commercial relationships. Perhaps most importantly, the League's legal power provided collective security. If a merchant from one Hanse city was robbed or unfairly treated in a foreign port, the entire League could impose a trade embargo, a devastating economic weapon that could bring a rebellious prince or a greedy city council to its knees. This was law backed not by armies, but by the irresistible force of commerce. The Hanseatic legal codes created a transnational commercial republic long before the concept of a nation-state was fully formed, proving that the most powerful law is sometimes the one that facilitates trust between strangers. How does a legal system designed for profit and pragmatism compare to one crafted for the spiritual salvation of an entire society? The Hanseatic merchant could rely on his commercial code, but a king's authority was ultimately measured by his power to summon an army. In 1303, King Philip IV of France issued a royal ordinance that reached into the life of every free man in his kingdom, asserting his right to call the arriere ban. This was not a call to his direct vassals, the great dukes and counts who owed him military service. This was a general levy, a demand that every free man, from the wealthy burgher in his townhouse to the peasant on his small plot of land, must take up arms in defense of the realm. The ordinance was a legal thunderclap, a formal declaration that the king's sovereignty now extended to the direct mobilization of the entire population. It transformed the ancient feudal obligation of military service into a national duty, a legal command that bypassed the complex chain of loyalty between lord and vassal. The king was now speaking directly to his subjects, and his word was law. The legal mechanism was as precise as it was sweeping. When the arriere ban was proclaimed, royal officials would fan out across the provinces, reading the ordinance in town squares and churchyards. Every able-bodied free man was expected to appear at a mustering point with his own weapons and provisions, ready to march under the royal banner. This was not an optional request, it was a compulsory summons backed by the full force of royal justice. Failure to appear could result in heavy fines or the confiscation of property. The Ordinance of 1303 was a stark declaration of growing state power. It demonstrated that the king's law could now compel the bodies of his subjects for the defense of the state itself, turning the abstract idea of the kingdom into a tangible reality that demanded personal sacrifice. How does a legal system designed to command every able-bodied man for war compare to one crafted to protect the most vulnerable members of society from the ravages of that very same conflict? A king's call to arms could summon an entire nation, but a whispered word in a dark corridor could now cost a man his head. For centuries, the crime of treason in England had been a vague and terrifying concept, a charge that could be shaped to fit the king's enemy of the moment. Then, in 1351, Parliament sought to end this dangerous ambiguity. The Treason Act did not invent the crime, but for the first time, it defined it with chilling precision in a written statute. Its core was a short, deadly list of specific actions that constituted high treason against the crown. To imagine or plan the death of the king or his family was treason, an act known as compassing the death of the sovereign. To wage war against the king within his own realm was treason. To adhere to the king's enemies, giving them aid or comfort, was treason, and counterfeiting the king's seal or his coinage was also treason, for it struck at the very symbols of his authority. This legal clarity was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it protected subjects from arbitrary accusations, giving every person a clear understanding of the line they must not cross. They now knew that certain thoughts and actions were utterly forbidden, but on the other hand, it gave the crown an immensely powerful and specific legal weapon. A monarch no longer had to rely on vague notions of disloyalty. They could point to the statute and prove that an opponent had levied war or compassed their death. The punishment for high treason was as severe as the crime was clear: drawing, hanging, and quartering for men, and burning for women. This gruesome fate was designed to be a terrifying public spectacle, a brutal reminder of the ultimate price of betrayal. The genius and the terror of the 1351 Act was its endurance. Its core definitions remained the law of the land for over 600 years, used to condemn men from rebellious peasants to kings themselves. How does a legal system designed to protect the state from its internal enemies begin to protect the individual from the state itself? A king's law could be absolute, but a merchant's contract needed to be flexible. In the bustling ports of the Crown of Aragon, a unique legal code was born not from a single royal decree, but from the slow accumulation of practical necessity. This was the Usages de Barcelona, a living body of law that began in the 12th century as a collection of feudal customs for the counts of Barcelona and grew to govern a maritime empire. It was a legal mosaic pieced together from the deep Visigothic traditions preserved in the Liber Judiciarum, the feudal practices brought by Frankish knights, and the sophisticated commercial logic of recovered Roman law. The Usages did not erase these older systems, it harmonized them, creating a hybrid legal culture perfectly suited to a realm that was both a feudal kingdom and a mercantile superpower. Its earliest clauses read like a handbook for a warrior aristocracy, detailing the ransom for a captured knight and the specific military service a vassal owed his lord. Yet woven alongside these feudal rules were statutes designed for the crowded, competitive streets of Barcelona itself, regulations for keeping the peace between powerful noble houses and resolving disputes over urban property. As the Crown of Aragon expanded, Swallowing the Balearic Islands, Sicily, and parts of Greece, the usages traveled with its armies and its merchants. It became the constitutional bedrock of a commonwealth of territories, a legal standard that provided a measure of consistency from the Pyrenees to the Aegean Sea. Its genius was its adaptability, its capacity to absorb local customs and new royal decrees without losing its core identity. How does a legal system designed for a growing empire ensure it does not become a rigid relic, but remains a tool for justice in a changing world? A king's justice could not rule a kingdom divided by its own laws. In the 14th century, Poland was a realm of deep legal fragmentation, where the ancient customs of one region held no sway in the next. King Casimir the Great faced a challenge of unification, not with an army, but with a scribe's pen. His solution was not a single, sweeping code, but a brilliant act of legal diplomacy, issuing two distinct statutes tailored to the traditions of his two main provinces. For Lesser Poland, centered around Krakow, he issued the Statute of Wisłaca around the year 1347. For Greater Poland to the northwest, he crafted a separate, complementary code. This was not an imposition of royal will from on high, but a careful process of gathering, refining, and writing down the existing customs of the people, transforming a chaotic tapestry of oral traditions into a clear, written standard. The statutes were comprehensive, tackling the entire spectrum of medieval life. They established a uniform penal law, setting consistent punishments for crimes like theft and violence, so that a criminal could not escape justice simply by crossing a provincial border. They meticulously defined property rights, creating a stable framework for inheriting land, resolving boundary disputes, and transferring ownership, which in turn encouraged agriculture and trade. But perhaps their most profound effect was the strengthening of royal justice itself. By creating a predictable, written legal process, the statutes drew power away from local magnates who had previously acted as lawgivers in their own domains. Royal judges could now travel the land, their authority backed by a code that applied to everyone, noble and commoner alike. Casimir's statutes did not erase regional identity, but they built a common legal roof under which all Poles could seek justice. They were a masterstroke of statecraft, proving that a kingdom is unified not when it has one law, but when all its people can trust the same system of courts. How does a legal system designed to bring internal order prepare a nation for the external threats that gather at its borders? The emperor's crown was not a father's legacy, but a prize to be won. In the sprawling, fractured realm of the Holy Roman Empire, the question of succession was a constant source of tension and war. Who had the right to choose the next emperor? For generations, the answer was a murky mix of tradition, bloodline, and raw political power, leading to rival claimants and devastating conflicts. Then, in 1356, Emperor Charles IV decided to end the uncertainty with a document of pure political genius, the Golden Bull. This was not a law for peasants or merchants, it was a constitution for kings, a rule book for creating an emperor. Its most famous decree formally established a college of 7 prince-electors, the men who would hold the exclusive, sacred right to choose the Roman king, who would then be crowned emperor by the Pope. These 7 were the archiepiscopal electors of Mainz, Cologne, and Trier, and the secular princes of the Palatinate, Saxony, Brandenburg, and the King of Bohemia, a title Charles held himself. The bull did not just grant them a vote, it made them semi-sovereign rulers in their own right. It declared their territories indivisible, to be passed intact to a single heir, preventing their power from being diluted through inheritance. It granted them the regalia of mining and minting, turning their lands into economic powerhouses with their own currency. It even gave them the legal authority to punish criminals within their domains without appeal to a higher court. In essence, the Golden Bull created 7 permanent, powerful pillars upon which the empire would rest. The election process itself was laid out with meticulous detail to prevent outside interference or last-minute corruption. The electors were to gather in Frankfurt upon a summons from the Archbishop of Mainz. They would swear an oath to vote without any secret agreements or gifts, a direct prohibition against the bribery that had plagued past elections. A simple majority of 4 votes was all that was required, a rule designed to prevent deadlock. The bull was a masterpiece of realpolitik, an admission that the empire was too vast and diverse to be ruled by force alone. By legally enshrining the power of the most powerful princes, Charles bought their loyalty and ensured a smoother, more predictable transfer of power. He sacrificed a measure of imperial authority to secure the empire's very survival. For centuries, this constitutional framework governed the heart of Europe, creating a unique, elective monarchy that stood in stark contrast to the hereditary kingdoms rising around it. The Golden Bull succeeded in its primary goal. It largely prevented disputed successions for over 400 years, but in securing the peace, did it also seal the empire's fate as a loose confederation of states, forever limiting the power of the man it was designed to crown. A king's throne secured by rebellion is never truly stable. Henry IV, who had seized the crown from his cousin Richard II, ruled a realm simmering with political and religious unrest. To secure his position, he needed to prove himself a defender of the Orthodox faith, and in 1401, Parliament gave him the ultimate weapon. The statute de heretico comburendo, meaning on the burning of a heretic, was a legal turning point of the most chilling kind. For the first time in English history, the secular law formally authorized the public execution of a person for their religious beliefs. The statute's primary target was the Lollards, followers of the theologian John Wycliffe, who questioned the wealth of the church, the authority of the priesthood, and the very doctrine of transubstantiation. These were not just theological debates, they were direct challenges to the social and political order, which was inextricably linked to the Catholic Church. The law created a devastating new procedure. Suspected heretics were to be arrested by royal officials and brought before a bishop's court for examination. If they refused to renounce their beliefs, or if they later relapsed into heresy after having once abjured, the church would declare them incorrigible and hand them over to the sheriff. The secular authority was then legally compelled to carry out the sentence, burning the condemned person in a public place. This gruesome division of labor was key. The church judged the soul's error, and the state supplied the fire to destroy the body. The first to die under this new statute was William Sawtry, a parish priest who had defiantly maintained his Lollard beliefs. His burning at Smithfield sent a shockwave of terror through the dissenting community. The law's true power, however, lay not in the number of its victims, but in the grim legal precedent it set. It established a template for state-sanctioned religious violence, a framework of persecution that would be tragically reused for generations. How does a legal system recover from codifying such fire into its very foundations, and where does it turn when it seeks not to punish belief, but to bring order to the chaos of the natural world? Fire could purge a heretic, but it could not save an empire. As the 14th century dawned, the Byzantine Empire was a ghost of its former self. Its territories shrunk to little more than the city of Constantinople and a few scattered provinces. The magnificent basilica, Leo the Wise's great legal code, was now a vast and cumbersome library for a realm that was running out of time. What the empire needed was not another grand monument, but a practical tool for survival. In 1345, a provincial judge named Constantine Harmonopoulos provided exactly that. His Hexabiblos, the 6 books, was a masterpiece of legal compression. He took the sprawling 60 books of the Basilica and distilled their essential wisdom into just 6 manageable volumes. This was not a dumbing down of the law, but a brilliant act of clarification. Harmonopoulos organized the material with a judge's eye for what was needed in a daily courtroom, focusing on the laws of property, inheritance, contracts, and crime that actually governed people's lives. He stripped away the archaic complexities and presented a clear, accessible summary that any local magistrate could use. The hexabiblos became the legal lifeblood of the empire's final century. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, you might expect that this Roman law book would have vanished into the ashes. But the opposite happened. The conquering Ottomans, in their pragmatic way, often allowed conquered peoples to govern their own communal affairs under their own religious laws. For the millions of Greek-speaking Christians now living under Muslim rule, the hexabiblos became their legal shield. Its clear, systematic rules for marriage, wills, and business disputes were adopted by the Orthodox Church as the official law for the Rum Millet, the community of Orthodox subjects. For nearly 400 years, under the shadow of minarets, Greek priests and village elders continued to use Harmonopoulos' book to settle their people's affairs, preserving a 1,000-year-old legal identity long after the empire that created it was gone. Its influence even crossed the ocean, forming the basis for the first civil code of the modern Greek state after independence. The hexabiblos teaches us a profound final lesson that the power of a legal code is measured not by the grandeur of its creation, but by its stubborn utility in a world of upheaval. It was the last great code of the medieval world, a practical guide for the end of days that refused to let the light of Roman justice be extinguished.